His horses, creatures of habit and instinct, wouldn't touch the creek, a place they'd always relied on. They were spooked, agitated, seeing something Wyatt couldn't. It wasn't until he stepped into that seemingly clear, innocent water himself that he began to unravel a secret so dark it would change everything he thought he knew about his home. What could possibly make a flowing creek a place of fear for a herd of horses? And what truth was it hiding beneath its gentle current? Before we begin, if this kind of story speaks to your heart, feel free to share where you're watching from. It's always beautiful to see how far stories like this can travel. July light in Red Mesa could blister the skin off a man's back. But that morning, the heat wasn't the problem. The silence was. Wyatt Callahan stepped out from the barn just as the sun crested over the red cliffs. The sky was empty, a hard blue that offered no mercy, no clouds, no breeze. His boots crunched over dry soil, dust rising like smoke from old wounds. The horses had gathered at the fence, but they weren't acting right. Heads low, ears pinned. Breathing shallow like they'd all just run a mile, though they hadn't moved an inch. Jessie, his old dun mare, pawed at the ground and let out a nervous snort. Her eyes were wide, not just spooked, but watching something Wyatt couldn't see. She flicked her ears back toward the creek that ran just beyond the slope. Normally, she'd already have waded in, taken a long drink, and dunked her nose just for the hell of it. But not today. Wyatt frowned and approached the fence line, eyes drifting past the pasture and down toward the creek. The water sparkled under the sun, flowing clear and steady over smooth rock, same as it always had since his father first put fence posts to ground in this corner of Arizona. Ash Hollow Creek had fed cattle, cooled wagon wheels, and washed his bloody knuckles more times than he could count. So why wouldn't they go near it? He grabbed his straw hat off the post and shoved it on his head. His spine tensed as he walked the familiar path to the water's edge. Halfway there, Jessie let out a sharp breath, a warning, not a greeting. Behind her, the rest of the horses pressed closer together like a herd facing a predator. Wyatt stopped, turned back. "I've seen you drink out of horse troughs that'd kill a buzzard," he muttered. "What's got you spooked now?" No answer, of course. Just uneasy eyes and trembling muscles. He crouched beside the creek. The water felt cold against his fingers. Clean, no scent, no oily sheen. He brought a handful up and sniffed again. Nothing unusual. Still, the unease prickled in his gut. A memory surfaced unbidden. Korea, winter of '51. His unit was camped near the ridge above the Han River. The dog's army-trained mutts had gone from calm to wild in under a minute, bolting for cover with their ears flat. The air was quiet. Then, 10 minutes later, mustard gas came rolling in like fog. Those dogs had known. Saved 20 men who listened. Animals didn't guess. They knew. Wyatt rose slowly and wiped his hands on his jeans. Something was wrong. He followed the creek upstream, eyes scanning the muddy bank. That's when he saw them. Hoof prints, not from his horses. These were smaller, tighter, fresher, recent, just hours old. 2 sets at least. No shoes on one, the other shod heavy. From the depth of the prints, they were riding slow and deliberate. He squinted into the distance where the creek wound through cottonwoods and low brush. Red cliffs loomed behind them, jagged like broken teeth. The wind shifted, bringing with it the faint rustle of something unnatural. Then cracked branches snapped on the ridge above. Wyatt dropped low and stepped behind a waist-high boulder, every muscle going quiet. The sun had crept high now, casting narrow shadows that sliced the canyon in lines of fire and ash. Then he heard them. Hoofbeats, measured, deliberate, the jingle of spurs, leather creaking, voices, low, male, just over the rise. Water's clean now. Buried deep enough. Old man's clueless. Wyatt's breath caught. His mouth went dry. He inched up slowly, careful not to shift the gravel beneath his boots. The voices faded, but left behind an echo in his chest, a sound like shovels hitting wet earth. Then one more voice. Closer. Different tone. Quiet, but cold. We'll be back tomorrow night. Silence fell again. Only the wind and the hush of the stream remained. Wyatt stayed behind the boulder a full minute before standing. The creek looked the same. Clear. Innocent. But his horses had seen through it. Or rather, smelled through it. They hadn't feared the water. They feared what the water tried to hide. He stood in the stillness, pulse throbbing, hands flexing as his mind turned over the words he'd just heard. He looked once more at the stream, glistening like it was proud of the secret it carried. They weren't scared of the water. They were scared of what the water was hiding beneath that gentle current. The next morning, the sun came up slow behind the ridgeline. But Wyatt Callahan was already saddled and gone. He hadn't slept much. The kind of sleep you get when your horses act like something's haunting them, and you hear strangers whispering about burying things in your water. That ain't rest. That's just darkness with your eyes shut. He'd thought about riding to town, maybe telling Sheriff Graves what he'd overheard, but Red Mesa was a hard day's ride. The creek bend where the voices came from was less than an hour's walk, and the men had said they'd be back tonight. That settled it. He packed a canteen, strapped his revolver to his hip, and started hiking before the sun had cleared the canyon rim. The farther he followed the creek, the more the world changed. The usual desert hum of insects faded, replaced by stillness so thick it felt like the trees were holding their breath. Even the air shifted cooler, heavier as he stepped into the canyon, where the red cliffs pinched the sky into a narrow slit above. The shadows grew deeper. The creek curved hard to the left, around a patch of cottonwoods tangled with thorn brush. It was a place animals avoided. Wyatt had always thought it was just the narrow trail or the uneven footing, but today it felt different, wrong. He crouched low by the bend and began to scan the bank. The dirt there had been disturbed. He could tell by the sloppy way the ground had been kicked back over something. Rocks were out of place. The way a boot presses earth is different than a hoof. This wasn't erosion. This was a cover-up. And then he saw it. Half buried under a root, snagged in the current, was a piece of torn green silk, soaked and limp like a ribbon from a drowned parade. Wyatt reached in and tugged it free. Expensive cloth city material, not the kind ranch wives wore. The edge was frayed and darkened. Blood. Not a guess. He'd seen enough to know. He felt the air leave his lungs in a slow, sharp breath. Then he spotted something else glinting in the mud. He dug it out with shaking fingers. A small gold ring, delicate, bent slightly out of shape. He wiped it clean on his sleeve. There, etched on the inner band. To BJ, forever, Rachel. Wyatt's throat tightened. His gut twisted. Rachel Jennings. She'd gone missing 2 weeks ago. Folks said she ran off with some drifter. Her husband, the county treasurer, didn't seem too heartbroken. Offered a reward, sure, but the whole thing stank of money and politics. Wyatt had met her once at a county fair. Graceful, kind, with eyes that didn't miss much. She wasn't the kind to run. She was the kind to ask questions. Maybe too many. And now, she was here. Or at least part of her was. A sudden noise snapped Wyatt's head up, hoofbeats, fast and getting closer. coming from the south trail. He shoved the ring into his shirt pocket and stepped into the shadow of a cedar. Dust rose before he saw the rider. Then, out of the trees, Clay Dobson burst into view, horse lathered in sweat. The man was riding like the devil was chasing him, or like he was chasing a secret. Clay was a neighbor, lived 2 ridges over, not close friends, but friendly enough. Shared coffee during cattle drives, traded hay one bad winter. But right now, Clay didn't look neighborly. He looked wired, twitchy. Wyatt stepped out slowly, hands visible. "Morning," he said. Clay reined hard, startled. "Jesus, Wyatt, you scared the piss out of me." "Didn't mean to. You're out early." "Could say the same for you." They stared at each other for a second too long. Clay's eyes darted toward the creek. "I was just riding through. Heard the sheriff's planning a full sweep. Figured I'd check in. Friendly-like." Wyatt didn't smile. "You always ride friendly with sweat on your collar and your gun snapped loose." Clay's jaw twitched. "Hot morning. Dusty trail." Wyatt nodded once. Slow. His fingers brushed the fabric in his pocket. The ring weighed heavier than gold. "You hear about Rachel Jennings?" he asked. Clay blinked. "Yeah, shame." "They still think she ran?" Clay hesitated. "That's what I heard." A long pause. Then Wyatt said, casual as a snake in the grass, "Funny thing, Clay. Sometimes the truth don't run. Sometimes it just waits in the mud." Clay's knuckles went white on the reins. The horses snorted. Wyatt's Jessie, who'd followed him from the pasture, stepped from behind a rock and walked between them. She stopped and fixed her eyes on Clay. Not a snort, not a twitch, just stillness. But it was a stillness that spoke. Clay swallowed hard. "I should get back," he muttered, yanking the reins. "Sure you should," Wyatt said, watching the man ride off like he was running from something with a name. Wyatt didn't move until the dust settled. Then he sat down by the creek, pulled the ring from his pocket, and stared at it again. Rachel Jennings had been here. She'd been buried here, and someone wanted to make sure nobody ever found out. But the water told the horses, and the horses told him, tonight, they'd be back. And Wyatt Callahan wasn't planning on sleeping. Clay Dobson's dust hadn't even settled before Wyatt turned back toward the creek, ring still in hand. The weight of it wasn't just gold anymore. It was a scream pressed into metal. He turned it over in his fingers, then slid it deep into his pocket, where it thudded against his ribs like a second heartbeat. The fabric from Rachel's dress was tucked into his shirt, damp and heavy against his chest. Wyatt had seen a lot of bad men in his time, men who wore their sins plain on their faces. But Clay was different. Clay was the kind of man who smiled too much and talked too little, who offered help without being asked and never let you see where his boots had been. Wyatt never trusted men like that. By midday, the heat rose sharp and angry, and the canyon pulsed with a dry hush. Wyatt sat in the shadow of a leaning cottonwood, watching the water snake around the rocks like it had nothing to hide. But the smell still lingered, just faint enough to make you doubt yourself. Like rust or memory. Around 3, he saddled up Jessie and rode back toward the homestead. She moved slow and steady beneath him, calm now that they were away from the bend. But she still didn't drink. She sniffed at the water trough and turned her head. Even a beast of habit knows when something's been tainted. At the edge of his pasture, Wyatt dismounted and waited. The sun was high, the breeze had stopped. Red mesa shimmered in the heat like glass left over a fire. He could feel it coming before he saw anything. The tension in the soil, the unease in the animals. Then, riders. 10 of them. Dust trailed behind them like a war drum. In the lead, wearing a wide-brimmed hat and a coat too nice for this weather, was Sheriff Harlan Graves. His mustache drooped like it carried the weight of every bad choice he'd ever let slide. The men behind him rode stiff rifles slung loose, eyes scanning, mouths drawn. Clay was already waiting. He leaned against the fence post like he'd been born there, arms crossed and chewing something that wasn't tobacco. "Sheriff," Wyatt said, nodding. "Callahan." Graves nodded back. "Hope we're not intruding." Wyatt gave a tight smile. "Just a bit of dust and drama. What brings you out this way?" "Rachel Jennings," Graves said without blinking. "You've heard." "I've heard she went missing. Reports say riders were seen out near your boundary the night she vanished." "Lot of riders passed through," Wyatt said. "That ain't new." "No," Graves agreed, swinging down from his saddle. "But her husband's been turning up stones, and some folks think maybe she turned up dead." Clay shifted. Wyatt caught it, the way his boots pivoted in the dirt like they were ready to run. "I was just telling the sheriff you hadn't seen anything," Clay said, his voice coated in sugar. Wyatt tilted his head. "That what you were saying, Clay?" Clay shrugged. "Didn't want him wasting time, that's all." Sheriff Graves raised an eyebrow. "What's the truth, Wyatt?" The silence that followed could have sliced hide off a steer. The men behind Graves watched. Even the horses stopped shifting. Wyatt exhaled, reached into his pocket, slowly. "You ever lose someone you couldn't bury, Sheriff?" Graves frowned. "What are you talking about?" Wyatt held up the ring. The gold caught the sun just right enough to draw every eye. Clay straightened. His hand slid down to his belt. "I found this 50 yards up my creek," Wyatt said, voice calm. "Along with part of a green silk dress. Expensive. Torn. Stained." Graves stepped forward slowly, eyes locked on the band. When he read the inscription, something shifted in his jaw grit, maybe. Or shame. Clay moved. Quick, but not quick enough. Wyatt had already stepped left, just enough so that Graves' 2 deputies had a clean line of sight. "Hands off that iron, Dobson," one of them barked. Clay froze. For a beat. Then he grinned. "You dumb bastard," he hissed at Wyatt. "You don't know what you just started." "No," Wyatt replied. "But I know how it ends." Graves nodded toward his men. "Take his gun." Clay's weapon hit the dirt with a dull thud. "Want to tell us the rest?" the sheriff asked. Clay's grin cracked. He looked at Wyatt, at Graves, at the 10 armed men staring him down. His face lost all color, and for the first time in years, Wyatt saw something in Clay Dobson that felt honest fear. "It wasn't supposed to go like this," Clay said, voice trembling. "She had a ledger. She threatened to go public. Said her husband was laundering county money through fake contracts." Wyatt's heart dropped. "She came out here," Clay continued. "She was going to meet someone. I don't know who called her, I swear. But then she disappeared, and we were told to take care of it. Just dispose of what was left." "Who's we?" Graves asked. Clay went quiet. "Who else? Helped you?" The sheriff growled. Clay looked to the east, toward town, toward power. "You start naming names, and maybe you don't hang," Graves said coldly. "I just helped bury her," Clay whispered. "I didn't kill her. I just followed orders." "You followed them real deep," Wyatt muttered, voice like gravel. Graves turned to his men. "We're going up the creek. Now." They found her not far from where Wyatt said, wrapped in silk and sorrow. Mud had stained her face, But her wedding ring was still missing, now resting heavy in Wyatt's shirt pocket. Near her body was a leather-bound ledger, water-warped but intact. It told a story clearer than any testimony. Fraud, laundering, kickbacks, names. Clay tried to run when they hauled her out, but Graves was faster than he looked, tied him up with his own belt, and tossed him over a saddle like a sack of guilt. As the sun sank behind the red cliffs, the truth rose out of the water, and Red Mesa would never look the same again. Evening had settled over Red Mesa like a lid on a boiling pot, sealing in the heat and tension that crackled in the air. The sun clung to the tops of the cliffs in the west, bleeding orange and crimson as if the land itself were bracing for a wound. Back at the homestead, Wyatt stood beside his fence, Jesse at his side, ears twitching at every sound. The rest of the sheriff's party had returned from the creek with somber eyes and dirt-covered hands. They dug her out carefully, Rachel Jennings wrapped in silk, face unrecognizable, but still clutching the dignity they couldn't bury with her. Sheriff Graves was quiet for a long time after they uncovered the ledger. He turned each page with a kind of slow-burning fury, his brows furrowed tighter with every name, every figure, every forged signature laid bare in Rachel's tidy handwriting. The woman had uncovered a web, and someone had decided to wrap it around her neck. Graves looked like a man who'd bitten into something rotten and had no choice but to chew. Now, under a sky painted in fire, he faced Wyatt again. "You sure you want to do this here?" Graves asked. Wyatt nodded once. "If it starts here, it ought to end here." The gathered deputies circled wide as Clay Dobson, hands tied, stumbled forward between them. He wasn't swaggering now. His shoulders had dropped. His shirt clung to him with sweat. The grin from earlier had vanished, replaced by something close to pleading. Graves spoke first. "You're going to tell us everything. Names, roles, orders." Clay swallowed. "You're not going to protect me?" "You buried a woman in a creek you don't even own," the sheriff snapped. "You lied to my face and tried to draw on a man who just handed us truth in gold. You don't get protection. You get a chance." Clay looked at Wyatt. "Why'd you have to go snooping, huh?" Wyatt stepped closer, voice like old oak. "Because your lies stunk up my water, Clay, and my horses knew it before I did." The deputies snorted in agreement, some of them giving Jesse a nod of respect. Clay cracked, then broke wide open like a dam under too much weight. He confessed to helping move Rachel's body, claimed he was paid off to clean up after it was done, claimed he hadn't known who was behind it at first, but the instructions were clear. Make her disappear. Make it quiet. And for God's sake, don't leave the ledger. They wanted it gone, he muttered. She was going to give it to the circuit judge. Said she'd ride out that morning to meet him. Had the names all lined up. "Names like who?" Graves asked, his jaw locked. Clay hesitated, then said it. "Mayor Tom Benton, Roy Talbot from the land office, and Harvey Leeds treasurer." A silence fell heavy enough to knock birds from the sky. Graves stepped back, expression unreadable. Wyatt watched his face carefully. "You knew some of this, didn't you?" Graves didn't answer right away. Then, quietly, "I knew Rachel was asking questions. Didn't know she'd found this much." "Did you look?" Wyatt asked. Graves exhaled. "I didn't want to." There it was, not guilt, but regret, and Wyatt knew the difference. "I ain't proud," the sheriff added, "but I'm going to fix it." He turned to his men. "Send riders to the judge. He's up in Gadsden. Tell him we've got a murder, a ledger, and one dead woman who deserves to be heard." Clay was dragged back into town, mouth shut now, eyes darting like he still hoped for some miracle. There would be no miracle, not for him. The creek had spoken, and Red Mesa would have to listen. As the group rode out, Wyatt lingered behind, watching the trail fade into dusk. Jesse nuzzled his arm, gentle and steady. "You did good, girl," he whispered. "You told me before anyone else did." He glanced back toward the creek. Its waters ran clean now, catching the dying light like polished glass. But it would never be just water again. It was a witness, and justice, slow as it had come, had started with a single snort from a thirsty mare. The sun climbed slow over Red Mesa the next morning, warm and golden, but softer somehow, less judgmental. The land had the hush of something finally exhaled. For the first time in days, the horses stood loose by the stream, not tense or braced, but calm. Even Jessie had stepped close, lowering her head toward the water with the quiet reverence of someone offering a prayer. Wyatt Callahan stood by the fence, arms folded, eyes tracing the curve of Ash Hollow Creek as it wound through the pasture. The water shimmered, clean now. It ran honest, and that mattered. It had taken just 3 days for the truth to spread through the county like a brush fire in high wind. Sheriff Graves rode into town that evening with Clay Dobson in irons, Rachel's ledger in one hand and her wedding ring in the other. Within hours, Judge McAllister had summoned federal marshals from Gadsden. Arrests followed swiftly. Mayor Benton, Roy Talbot, and finally, with a pale face and trembling hands, Harvey Leeds himself, still wearing the lapel pin of the office he'd corrupted. People were stunned, angry, but mostly they were ashamed. Ashamed that a woman had screamed on paper, in records and receipts, and no one had listened until she went silent in a shallow grave. Wyatt didn't attend the public hearings, didn't stand up at the church vigil for Rachel Jennings, but he did ride into town once, just long enough to hand her obituary clipping to the newspaper editor and say, "She earned better words than those." They reprinted the story with a full front-page spread. Back home, Wyatt worked in silence. Fixed a gate. Patched a section of roof he'd been putting off. But mostly he stayed near the stream, as if keeping it company now that its burden had been lifted. Jessie was the first to drink. She stepped down into the creek that morning, her hooves sinking slightly in the soft mud, and bent her head to sip without hesitation. The rest followed, one by one, until the entire herd stood knee-deep in the water they'd once refused. Wyatt crouched nearby, watching them with a quiet satisfaction that didn't need to be spoken. He pulled a folded copy of the Red Mesa Gazette from his coat and read the final lines of Rachel's obituary aloud. She believed the truth mattered. She paid the price most never have to. He folded the paper again and tucked it into the inside pocket of his worn jacket. Jessie stepped up beside him, pressed her nose gently against his shoulder. He smiled. "You knew, didn't you?" he murmured. "Before I did." She huffed softly, then nibbled at his collar like she had when she was a colt. Wyatt scratched behind her ears, heart heavier than he'd expected it to be, not from grief, but from the strange, quiet weight of closure. They'd found Rachel. They'd heard her. They'd answered. That night, the air over the pasture felt cooler, like a fever had broken. Crickets returned to the brush. An owl called out from the canyon wall. The land was breathing again. Sheriff Graves stopped by one last time before the trial, handed Wyatt an envelope without speaking. Inside was a letter from Rachel's sister, "Oh, thank you," handwritten in blue ink. At the bottom, "You gave her voice back." Wyatt didn't reply, just nodded. Later, he sat by the creek with a mug of black coffee and no fire, watching stars blink into view. Jesse stood nearby, alert but relaxed. The current rippled gently in the moonlight, running clear, running honest. Not just a stream anymore. A witness, a messenger. A grave that refused to stay quiet. Some truths are too stubborn to drown, especially when the horses already knew. So what would you have done if your horses warned you first, and the truth rose like a ghost from the creek? Wyatt's story reminds us that sometimes the quietest voices or even the silent warnings of nature hold the greatest truths. We're curious to know, what personal lessons or traditions from your own life have guided you through difficult times? Share your wisdom in the comments. If you found this journey into the heart of the American West meaningful, please give us a thumbs up and subscribe to our channel for more tales of courage and community. Thank you for watching, and we'll see you in the next story.